What I'm going to be talking about this evening is an absolutely massive subject. I mean, I can only really give you a taster of it. And we're very lucky in that if you want to follow up what I'm talking about this evening, we have now got this splendid book by Catherine Hurlock, Medieval Welsh Pilgrimage, 1100 to 1500, which will give you a lot more of the detail of what I'm talking about, and will also give you some of the references. And I think it's still worth looking at Hartwell Jones's Celtic Britain and the Pilgrim Movement. It's 100 years old now, but it's still very, very useful, particularly for the amount of the poetry about pilgrimage that he includes. So it's perhaps more useful as a source book than a discussion nowadays. But there is this modern book as well, Catherine Hurlock's. My own background on this is that I've done quite a bit of research on pilgrimage, mainly from the sort of practical landscape point of view, actually tracking pilgrimage routes in the landscape. And I've also led several pilgrimages. We used to do a pilgrimage every year up to Penrhys in the Rhondda. And I have to say, I don't do spiritual leadership. I don't feel competent to do that. But I was the one who found the way and knew which turning to take and things like that. So I have got a background in modern pilgrimage as well. But what has always struck me is the extent to which pilgrimage has always been part of the Welsh tradition. We've got this story, for example, which you can actually see on the reconstructed rood screen in the church of St. Tylo, which has been rebuilt in the museum at St. Fagans. It's a story about how one of Abbey Cumhair's local saints, St. Padarn, plus his mates, Tylo and Dewi, went to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, and miraculously 3 thrones appeared for them to sit on when they got to Jerusalem. We've actually got 2 accounts of the life of St. Winifred, saint from North Wales, which, interestingly enough, have very different pilgrimage stories in them. Both lives were written down in the early 12th century, probably round about the 1130s. And the first version is a story about a very strong-minded young woman who defies authority, decides she herself wants to share her life with God. The local prince has other ideas. She manages to outwit him and escape from him, but he pursues her and cuts her head off. 10 out of 10 for commitment, but as a strategy for seduction, I have to say it could have done a bit more work. She's healed by another saint who's been teaching her, and he leaves her in Holywell, where she's been brought up. She decides to go on a pilgrimage. She goes on a pilgrimage to Rome. While she's in Rome, she discovers Benedict's ideas of community-based monasticism, brings them back to Britain, summons a synod of the whole Church of Britain, introduces these new ideas, goes and finds a monastery herself, and there she lives and dies. The second version of her life is very, very different. It also includes a pilgrimage, but it's not the story of a strong-minded young woman. This is the version that was put together by Robert Pennant, the prior of Shrewsbury, who masterminded the transfer of Winifred's relics from where she ended up in Gwytherin, south of Conwy, to Shrewsbury. If you've read Ellis Peters' Brother Cadfael novels, this provides the plot of the first of them. In Robert Pennant's version of the story, she's an innocent girl. She doesn't understand what the prince wants, but when she eventually understands, she runs and he cuts her head off. The story is really more about the miraculous healing which her tutor, St. Bino, manages. And Bino founds a religious community for her in Holywell and leaves her there. But when she hears that Bino has died, she goes looking for another male mentor. And the journey that she takes looking for another male mentor, she goes from Holywell, she goes over the hills to Bodvari, where she talks to St. David. She goes on to Henllan, where she talks to St. Saturnus, and she ends up in Gwytherin, where she meets a saint called Eleri, who in this version of the story is a man. Eleri has found a community for nuns in Gwytherin, and she joins it. It's a very, very different take on what it takes to be a female saint. And I think, in fact, that the journey which Robert Pennant describes her making from Holywell, bypassing Denbigh and down to Gwytherin, is probably based on the route that medieval pilgrims would have taken, going from Holywell, the site of her first near martyrdom, to Gwytherin, where they still claimed some relics of her, even after her body had been moved to Shrewsbury. But I think the key point about all these stories of pilgrimage, there are lots of others as well. David goes on pilgrimage, Caddoc goes on pilgrimage. It's seen as being quite an ordinary thing to do. It's not seen as being particularly challenging, particularly dangerous. And there are no miracle stories in which the pilgrims are threatened by wild beasts, or their ship is nearly shipwrecked in a storm and the saint prays and they are saved. There's none of that. They went to Jerusalem, and when they got there, this is what they did. She went to Rome, and when she got there, this is what she did. Travel was not as difficult in those days as we think it is, I think. And long distance travel as a pilgrim doesn't seem to have been considered to be terrifyingly out of the ordinary. Wales had its own pilgrimage shrines as well. And there was St. David's, of course, I mean, still an important focus for pilgrimage. William the Conqueror, after he defeated the English in 1066, started looking towards Wales, and he went on what he called a pilgrimage to St. David's. He had most of the army with him, and we think he was making a political point. But nevertheless, he badged it as a pilgrimage. That was how he felt he should do it. And then in 1123, of course, I mean, this year we are celebrating the 900th anniversary of that papal bull, Pope Calixtus II, declaring that 2 pilgrimages to St. David's were the equivalent of 1 to Rome, 3 pilgrimages to St. David's were the equivalent of 1 to the Holy Land, which is a pretty good deal if you're starting out in Wales in the first place. Calixtus seems to have had a vision of a Western Christendom, what we would now call Europe, tied together by a web of pilgrimage routes. He was the same Pope who popularized and promoted the pilgrimage to Compostela in northern Spain. So he seems to have had an idea that pilgrimage was going to bring people together, was going to unite the church in Western Europe. And it's a vision which has actually been revived towards the end of the 20th century. The Council of Europe started working on the big pilgrimage routes in Europe, seeing the success of the route to Compostela as something that they could develop in order to bring people together. Without wanting to be too political, it's something I think we still stand very much in need of. So how did people get from wherever they were traveling from to St. David's, which was obviously the important pilgrimage shrine in Wales in the Middle Ages? People came from outside as well. The route there from England, we don't really know until a route from London to St. David's gets mapped by a man called John Ogilby as late as 1675. Now, John Ogilby wrote a book called Britannia, in which he had detailed maps of a number of routes, 60, 70, 80 routes in England and Wales. And one of the ones that he chose, because he felt it was an important route, was the route from London to St. David's. His work in Wales and the Borders has been studied by a man called Derek Bissell, who's actually walked or driven virtually every inch of the roads that Ogilby mapped in Wales. This is Ogilby's route from London to St. David's, which gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. You can see it goes through South Wales. You've got Monmouth, Trellick, Newport, Cardiff, and then on through the Vale of Glamorgan and eventually getting towards Neath. And the route is traceable on the ground now. Derek Bissell looked at the route as it goes. Let's go back up again a minute. Derek Bissell looked at the route as it goes from Monmouth through the villages to Trellick, over the Wentwood, and down towards Newport. And that's actually quite a pleasant, walkable route nowadays. There has been talk about trying to revive a pilgrimage route from England and ultimately from continental Europe to St. David's. The idea originally was that it was going to be part of the 2023 celebrations. I think we've rather overshot that one now. Part of the problem is that, yes, as far from Monmouth to, well, Newport, it goes off-road. It's quite a pleasant walk. It goes through Trellick, for example, where we've got a very rare example of a medieval pilgrimage souvenir from Wales. We don't have many pilgrimage souvenirs in Wales. We don't know why. We don't seem to have the number of pilgrim badges that they had in England. But this little medieval ampulla, it turned up in an archaeological excavation at Trellick, which is roughly near Monmouth and Chepstow. And it was made of lead. It would have contained a little bit of holy water, and someone would have strung it around their neck from these, and either left it in Trellick or maybe even lost it there. But from Newport onwards, the line that Ogilvy maps pretty much follows the line of the Roman road into West Wales, which is the line of the roads which we now know as the A48 and the A40. So it's not really very walkable as a pilgrim route anymore. Carmarthenshire Ramblers have been working on alternatives. They did walk a route in West Wales, taking themselves from roundabout Carmarthen to St. David's as part of the 2023 celebrations. And it's possible that might get made into a permanent route. So there's still potential for pilgrimage to St. David's. There's a similar tradition at Enlli, Bardsey Island. The tradition about Enlli was that 3 times there were the equivalent of once to Rome, which I must admit, I think rather sells it short, because it is a very difficult journey. The sea between Manila-Nelog, the furthest point of the Llŷn Peninsula, and Ynys Enlli, Bardsey Island, is very, very treacherous. And I know a number of people who've tried to get there on pilgrimage 5 or 6 times and have failed because the sea has simply been too dangerous for the boats to set out. But what Enlli was really famous for was as the burial place of 20,000 saints. The very ground is made of the bones of saints, they say. And it had an early medieval monastic community living there, and that became a medieval Augustinian priory, whose ruins you can still see on the island. There was a saint called Dyfrig, who was active all over Wales. He was eventually buried on Bardsey Island, and about 900 years ago, the then Bishop of Llandaff, Bishop Gurgan, decided that he needed more relics in his cathedral at Llandaff, went to Enlli, went to Bardsey Island, found what he claimed to be Dyfrig's relics, and brought them back to Llandaff. So I suppose it's now not 20,000 saints, but 19,999. Gurgan then commissioned a life of St. Dyfrig, which describes Enlli as the Rome of Britain because of the number of saints that were buried there. And we've also got a lovely deathbed poem by a poet called Meilir, which you can find in the Oxford Book of Welsh Verse. He died in about 1140. And I'll read it to you in translation. He describes Enlli as being in a fold of the sea, its graves embraced by the sea, fair Mary's island, pure island of the pure. And he said he knows his creator will meet him in that fair parish of Enlli's people. So it was a very important shrine for Welsh people. We don't know really how many pilgrims from outside Wales went there. we do know that a lot of pilgrims from outside Wales went to Winifred's first shrine at Holywell. This rather spectacular late medieval building, which is now the Well and the Well Chapel, rebuilt in the later Middle Ages, it's often credited to Henry VII's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was one of the most powerful people behind the scenes in the politics of the later Wars of the Roses and the early Tudor period. She was famously powerful, famously devout. And some of the imagery in the Well Chapel is pointing you in the direction of Lady Margaret Beaufort and her third husband, Thomas Stanley, Lord Derby. But there's also evidence from the poetry that the abbots of Basingstoke, the Cistercian abbey just down the road, had a lot to do with the rebuilding of the Well Chapel. And Cadw have done dendrochronological dating of some of the roof timbers of the Well Chapel, which puts it as late as the late 1520s. Margaret Beaufort died in 1509. So there was obviously a lot going on there, even after her day. You can imagine her getting the project started, not finishing it, and the Abbot Pennant of Basingstoke taking the project over, because pilgrimage to Holywell was obviously very, very useful. The pilgrims stayed at Basingstoke Abbey. They brought money into Basingstoke Abbey. There were practical reasons for him to want to promote the pilgrimage and to want to continue to develop the site and make it as splendid as possible. Holywell is an oddity in that it's a pilgrimage there survives after the Reformation. All this sort of stuff was supposed to be swept away. Somehow at Holywell, that didn't happen. And I do wonder whether that is because of the Lady Margaret Beaufort connection. She was quite a terrifying woman, and the thought of her ghost coming back and haunting you because you'd damaged her Well Chapel would have been pretty intimidating. Pilgrimage went on there. The gunpowder conspirators went there on a sort of an away day. That didn't really work. King James II of England, who was notoriously a Catholic, he and his first wife had a couple of daughters. He and his second wife had no children. She wanted a pilgrimage to Compostela to pray for a child. He went to Holywell. That worked, but not in the long term, because the boy that was born, there was political uprising, and James and his family were eventually kicked out of the country. The boy who may have arrived as a result of James's prayers at Holywell became James III, the old pretender. His son is Bonnie Prince Charlie, the young pretender. That was what happened to that line. I wonder whether it was actually the impact of bathing in the cold water, which is said to help with fertility problems, but who knows? Who knows? Ogilvy also plotted a route from St. David's to Holywell in his famous 1675 book of road maps. And the late great Terry Jones, him off of Monty Python, he had a sort of alternative existence as quite an interesting historian. And he came across Ogilvy's work. And where people like Derek Bissell were concerned with the practicalities, where exactly did Ogilvy's routes go, which of these footpaths is the line of the route that he's plotting, etc. Terry Jones was much more interested in the politics. Why did Ogilvy choose this rather obscure route between St. David's, fairly obscure shrine in Western Wales, and Holywell? And the date when Ogilvy is working, Terry Jones said, was the answer. 1675. Charles II was on the throne. He was known to be soft on Catholicism. He had no children of his own. The heir was his younger brother James, an out-of-the-closet Catholic, at a time when Catholics really were being perceived as the enemy within. So Ogilvy is just sort of edging towards saying, you know, we could revive some of these pilgrimage routes, but not wanting to plot a route to somewhere as obvious and high visibility as, let's say, Walsingham, for example, but plotting a couple of routes in Wales where it wasn't really high profile, but it was there. And he was just kind of nudging in the direction of saying, we could revive this, you know, if the king wanted to. We could, we really could. So there's a lot of politics behind the survival of the shrine at Holywell, a lot of politics behind Ogilvy's promotion of a route from St David's up the west coast, across through Machynlleth and Dolgellau, through the Vale of Clwyd, and eventually up to Holywell. As I said, Holywell was connected with the Cistercians at Basingstoke. And of course, most of the Cistercian houses had something to attract pilgrims. Llantarnam, which is near Cwmbran in South Wales, had this shrine of the Virgin Mary at Penrhys up in the Rhondda. There's Ogilvy's route from St David's to Holywell. At Penrhys, there was said to be a miraculous statue of the Virgin Mary. It was found in an oak tree. 10 gangs of oxen couldn't drag it from the site. A chapel was built there to house it. This is, there are ways of interpreting that story that aren't quite so incredible. The medieval statue, the wooden statue, was destroyed, as far as we know, at the Reformation. What's there now is a modern stone statue that was put up by the Catholic Church in the 1950s. And what survives from the medieval period is the Holy Well, which is mostly medieval. And there was enough evidence to enable us to reconstruct a medieval route from Llantarnam to Penrhys, going round the hills above Cwmbran, over to Risca, Bedwas, Caerphilly, Eglwys Ullin, crossing the River Taff just north of Pontypridd on a wooden bridge that was much earlier than that famous William Edwards stone bridge, and then up into the Rhondda. And this is the route along which I led pilgrims for many years. There were other Cistercian houses with important things to attract pilgrimage as well. Ystrad Fflyd is on a nexus of pilgrimage routes, and of course had the Nanteus Cup. Ystrad Marchel, Strata Marcella, claimed a fragment of the True Cross. What Abbey Cwmhere had was what was described as a miraculous picture of Jesus. Now, I think this was almost certainly a Veronica. The tradition was, in the Bible, a woman is described as wiping Jesus's face with a cloth. And the tradition was that his face became imprinted on that cloth. And she is called Veronica from the Latin word vera, icon, a true representation. And this was the best example I could find of a late 15th century painting of the Veronica that I thought, although it's actually German, I thought might give you an idea of what the miraculous painting at Abbey Cwmhere might have looked like. I think what we have to remember, there were copies of this painting, copies of this true icon all over Europe. We shouldn't think of them as fakes. They are replicas. Everyone knew that wasn't the original. The Welsh poets saw what claimed to be the original in Rome and wrote about it, but there were copies of it. It's a bit like things like what Valacrocus had, which was a speaking statue of Jesus, and things like the Delw Fyw, the living image in the parish church in Mold. They're not there to deceive people. They're not there to confuse people. People know this is an image. People know this is a mechanical, something which works. You pull the levers and it moves its hands. They're there to enhance the experience, and they're there to help people focus on what they're depicting. Medieval veneration of what claimed to be the original Veronica in Rome and of its many copies are part of a late medieval devotional habit, a cult of what is sometimes called the Arma Christi, the depiction of Christ's wounds, 2 hands, 2 feet, and the wounded heart, and all the implements of the crucifixion story. And here they are, again, depicted from a European picture. You can see, I mean, the scourge, the sponge on a stick, the goblet of water, the jug of water, the hand which hit Christ's face, the lantern from the Gethsemane part of the story. And at the top of that, you can see a representation of the Veronica. I'm trying to use, whoop, there we are. And there was a famous Middle English poem, O Vernicle, which actually takes you through a meditation on each of these items, a sort of archaeology, if you like, of the crucifixion story. O Vernicle, I honour him and thee, that thee made through his privity. The cloth he set to his face, last printed through his grace, his mouth, his nose, his 2 eyes, his beard, his hair, and praise to that shield me from everything that in my life I have sinned with my 5 wits, that I've slandered with my mouth, I've sworn false oaths, I've been guilty of backbiting, I've boasted with my tongue. Lord of heaven, forgive it me for thy figure that I here see. So it takes you through each of the items in the crucifixion story. It applies it to something that you are responsible for, something you've had a problem with. Another example is the vessel of vinegar and gall. The scroll, this gives you a picture of a jug, and it gives you the little verse, the vessel of acil and of gall. Lord, keep me from the sins all that to soul be venom, that I be not poisoned therein. So you can see how it works through all of life's problems. And you focus on an item from the crucifixion story, and it helps you to deal with that particular problematic aspect of your life. So that is what the miraculous painting of Jesus at Abbey Come Here was probably part of. We don't have a surviving Welsh version of the poem O Vernicle, though that's not to say that there wasn't one. We have lost a huge amount. But there was something called the 15 Prayers of St. Bridget, which is a meditation on episodes of the crucifixion story, including things like the nails, the crown of thorns, the sponge with the vinegar and the gall. And that sequence of prayers, which is attributed to St. Bridget of Sweden, it probably wasn't her, in fact, survives in several Welsh translations. And that does the same thing as the poem O Vernicle, in that it associates each of the things she's talking about with human problems, human needs, human sinfulness. So again, this is the same sort of path to what was clearly a very popular way of appropriating the crucifixion story and making it something that was relevant to you. And pilgrims who came to Abbey Come Here to see that miraculous painting, that would have been the devotional tradition that they were following. So how did they get to Abbey Come Here? Well, I don't want to talk too much about reconstructing the road system, the medieval road system around Abercwmbir, because I know this is something Mel's been doing a lot of work on, and I think this is potentially a separate lecture. But Mel very kindly sent me this map of some of the medieval and slightly later routes that could have taken people to or near Cwmhere. The brown line is the line of the Monk's Trot. I mean, that, you know, the members of the Abercwmbir Society will know that one very, very well. I don't know whether there are plans to get back to walking it, but it's a stiff walk, but I have actually done it, but not with the society. There is a very well evidenced Roman route, goes up the valley slightly to the west of Cwmhere, and the black lines on this map are from Bob Sylvester of the Clywyd Powys Archaeological Trust's work on all possible Roman routes in this area. You can see there is one that actually comes very close to Cwmhere. We're not entirely sure what its evidence is for some of these, and I think more work needs to be done on this. And the green line is Ogleby again. He mapped a road from London to Aberystwyth, and it goes just slightly south of Cwmhere. Here we are, here it is, going past Bwlch-Gryndynan, past Aronen, and on. And there are two turnings. Here is the actual map. You can see there are two turnings on his map marked to Cwmhere. This one, I think, this is the road down to Nant Nel. So this must be the track that crosses the B road here and then becomes a bridleway over through the woods to get to Cwmhere. This one is a bit more difficult to identify. Ogilvy's road measurements are surprisingly accurate for the period, and you can see that this one is 2.6. Where am I? This one is 2.66. This one is 2.67. So these two turnings must be about a mile apart. So our best guess is that the second one is a route going up from somewhere just west of Aronen, and Mel did show me a LiDAR image of the hill above Aronen and going over Camlow Hill, which has actually got quite a zigzag line marked on it, which we think might be the line of that route. But as I say, more work does need to be done on that. And then just to the east of Cwmhere, you've got Ogilvy's route from Cardiff to Chester. So Cwmhere is in the middle of a nexus of through routes and smaller routes actually going into Cwmhere itself. It would have been readily accessible. I know it feels remote now. It wouldn't have been anything like as remote then. So we've got Cwmhere as one of the popular pilgrimage objectives in medieval Wales. People may have come from England as well. But of course, the Welsh also went on pilgrimage elsewhere. They went to what the Welsh poet Lewis Glyn Cothi called the Tair Ffynnon Gwynion i'r Tregaredd, the three blessed fountains of mercy: Rome, Santiago, and of course the Holy Land. And pilgrims who went to Rome, the Welsh poets who went on pilgrimage to Rome in the 15th century, and a lot of them did, they all comment on the relics that they saw there. They saw what they believed to be the pillar where Christ was tied to be scourged. They saw 9 thorns from the crown of thorns. They saw the vernicle. They saw the sponge. They saw a piece of the true cross. And they write quite extensively about their experiences. Howell Daffy went to Santiago on the traditional Welsh route, sailing from Tenby to Corunna with a group of pilgrims from southwest Wales. And pilgrims did go to the Holy Land. The This is the brass monument of Sir Hugh Jones and his wife Maud. He's a Gower landowner, and their monument survives in a rather battered condition in the Church of St Mary in Swansea. And it records with considerable pride that he was made knight at the Holy Sepulchre of our Lord Jesus Christ in the city of Jerusalem, the 14th day of August, year of our Lord God, 1441. So what were these pilgrimage journeys like? And the poets do talk about the hardship of the journey to some extent. But it can't have been that dreadful because they even took their children with them. Hugh Cysoed, the poet, took his young son with him to Rome. And they were amazed by the city's treasures. If you wanted to count the relics there, he said, you might just as well try to count the pebbles of the sea. So Welsh people were not as inward looking as we sometimes imagine they were in the Middle Ages. They went on crusade, they went on pilgrimage, they went on quite challenging pilgrimages. There was a surprising amount of travel. Why did people go? One of the main reasons was, of course, penance. If you'd done wrong, you'd confessed your sins, you'd received absolution, you still had to put things right. And the way of putting things right might be something practical, rebuilding the wall you've demolished, making it up somehow to the people that you'd hurt. But you would also have to put it right with God. And you put it right with God by doing some form of penance. I mean, the penance might be giving 5 shillings to the rebuilding of your church tower. The penance might be going on a barefoot pilgrimage to Jerusalem and never coming back. It depended on what you'd done. So people did go on pilgrimage for penance. But they also went out of straightforward devotion. And you get the feeling that there's a certain amount of that in what Sir Hugh Jones has done. He doesn't say anything about having needed penance. And of course, people went for healing. Chaucer, in the introduction to his Canterbury Tales, talks about how people, most of all, from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they went, that holy blissful martyr for to seek, that them have holpen, found that they were sick. So, in other words, they'd prayed to St. Thomas of Canterbury for help. He had healed them. They now went on the pilgrimage that they'd promised to go on. It's easy to be cynical about healing from pilgrimage. And it's true that for some people, what they had was illnesses that go into remission and then flare up again. They could go on a pilgrimage. They could credit the pilgrimage with the remission and what was happening to them, and it could then flare up again afterwards. But there are a lot of ways in which going on a pilgrimage could be genuinely healing. Purely practical reasons to start off with. What Chaucer describes as the popular time for going on pilgrimage is spring. In spring, you would have eaten the fresh food. You start to get deficiency diseases. If you went on a pilgrimage, you stayed in monasteries, you stayed in pilgrim hostels, you were probably going to get a better diet than you had on your farm or wherever you were living. Your deficiency disease might clear up. There are deeper ways as well that going on a pilgrimage can still be healing. We know a lot more now than we used to about the tie-up between mental health and physical health. We know how stress can make your stomach ache, it can make your back ache. Extreme trauma can leave you unable to speak, unable to hear. I've got a bit of background on this one myself because my husband has mental health problems. He had a complete breakdown about 6 years ago. And what it turned out to be was a form of depression that mimics the symptoms of physical illnesses. So they thought he had a form of epilepsy. They thought he had a form of Parkinson's. And it turned out to be a mental breakdown. Now, when you have mental health problems, what you are advised to do: fresh air, moderate exercise, Healthy diet. What did you get on a pilgrimage? Fresh air, moderate exercise, and a healthy diet. And if that didn't work, what are we recommended to do? Talking therapies. What did you get on a pilgrimage? You could talk to your fellow pilgrims. You would, if you were traveling in a group, you would probably have a priest, a friar, someone who was trained to talk people through things, using the language of the time, using the language of faith. But the Christian practice of confession and absolution maps quite nicely onto modern therapeutic practice of enabling people to talk through their problems and put them behind them. So a pilgrimage could be a healing experience in a lot of ways. One thing which I have actually found on pilgrimages is how much easier it is to talk to people when you're walking, because you're not making eye contact. And if the conversation gets too difficult, you can stop, you can talk about the landscape you're going through, you can get out of breath going up a hill, and it can take the sting out of a difficult conversation. When we were preparing the route from Llantarnam to Penrhys, we walked various possible alternatives. And I can remember a whole day exploring the route between Risca and Caerphilly with a Catholic priest and an Eastern Orthodox priest. And we argued most of the day, mainly about the role of women in the ministry. And if I'd been in a meeting, I think I'd have lasted about 10 minutes before I threw the furniture at them and walked out. But because we were walking, that didn't happen. We're still friends. So pilgrimage could be a very practical way of healing and also a more emotional way of healing as well. There were people who went on pilgrimage on behalf of others. It could be a kind thing to do. There were local guilds. I mean, a guild of St. James, for example, would raise money, and eventually they would be able to afford to send one of their members to Compostela on behalf of all the others. There was also a rather more commercial aspect to what you might call vicarious pilgrimage. Someone who had promised to go on a pilgrimage or who wanted to go on a pilgrimage but simply couldn't or felt they couldn't, work was too pressing. Members of the aristocracy who had political careers, they would literally pay someone else. You know, you could get paid £10 for going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land on someone's behalf. There were people for whom that was a way of making a living. They just kept goofing. Another thing that people got out of pilgrimage, and this is rather more worldly, they got a sense of adventure. And that, I think, was particularly important for women. It was difficult for a woman to travel on her own. It was difficult for a woman to experience things on her own. But you went in a group and you had people around you who would support you, who would help to protect the group. It also gave you a reason for going. I mean, if you said to the family that was absolutely driving you to distraction, I've had enough of you lot, I'm off. You couldn't really do that. If you said, you lot need help, I am going to go on a pilgrimage on your behalf, that was a good reason for going. So it did give women in particular scope to travel, to experience some sort of adventure. People got other practical things out of it. Sometimes it widened horizons. People learned craft skills. They made trade contacts. And for the whole of society, it produced travel infrastructure. On a large scale, the route across northern Spain to Compostela had bridges across the most dangerous rivers built by members of the royal family of northern Spain. On a smaller level, I have tracked where the bridges were on the route from Llantarnam to Penrhys. There was a wooden bridge across the Taff. There were 5 wooden bridges across the Rhondda. Those were there for pilgrims. They were presumably constructed on the orders of the monks of Llantarnam. And within about 40 years of the destruction of the shrine at Penfreece, the bridges had also fallen into the river. So although they were there initially for pilgrims, they had provided the ability to travel for everybody. Once the pilgrimage went, that went as well. So that's medieval pilgrimage. If we think about all this now in the context of modern pilgrimage, it is becoming increasingly popular. I think every Welsh diocese has now had a diocesan year of pilgrimage. We in the Diocese of Llandaff were going to have our diocesan year of pilgrimage in 2020. That went well. It was a bit of a challenge, actually, because we'd done a huge amount of preparation. We'd worked out several routes that we were going to focus on. We'd worked out various things that we were going to do. And then the pandemic started. And there was a move to say, well, we'll do it again next year. And then we thought, well, actually, no. Are we actually being nudged in the direction of thinking about pilgrimage in a slightly different way? And for me, I have to admit, pilgrimage has to do with serious walking. It has to present that kind of challenge. But for more and more people, doing that kind of serious walking becomes impossible. And we had, thinking about the diocesan year of pilgrimage in 2020, we had already started thinking about pilgrimage for people who couldn't travel very far. We'd started thinking about interior pilgrimage. We were very much inspired by an Anglican clergyman from the West Midlands. His name is Andy Delmege. He had a sabbatical back in 2016, I think it was, and he said he was going to walk the whole of the Cistercian Way, which is a round Wales pilgrimage route that I've been working on. And he set off, and he got as far as Whitland, and he injured his knee. And he was a very tough walker. He'd done the route to Compostela several times. He'd done other pilgrimage routes as well. He reckoned he was pretty fit. But somehow he did his knee. And he limped into the modern Cistercian nunnery at Whitland. And two of the nuns who had been nurses looked at his knee and they said, Father Andy, you are going home. You are going on the train and we are going to take you to the station. And the nuns at Whitland, they're very sweet and they're very obliging and they're as tough as they come. And when they say you are going home, you go home. So poor Andy Delmege had to go home. And the time that he was going to spend on this great walking pilgrimage all around Wales, he had to spend in his own front room with his foot up and an ice pack on his knee. And he said it was actually the most important pilgrimage he'd ever been on, because he had to deal with his own sense of not being able to do what he'd been so proud about being able to do. So we used that as inspiration. We used the work of the famous Persian poet and mystic Hafiz, who once said, I felt in need of a great pilgrimage, so I stayed still for 3 days. And in 2020, we'd already been working on ideas on interior pilgrimage. So we ran with that instead. But pilgrimage is popular and people are working on pilgrimage routes for people to walk. In my own part of South Wales, there's Penfreece Pilgrim's Way, there's the Cistercian Way, which that was really only ever meant to be a one-off. In 1998, when we were celebrating the 900th anniversary of the founding of the order, a colleague of mine in Cardiff came up with this bright idea, why don't we do a pilgrimage around all the Cistercian sites in Wales, medieval and modern? And when he said we, he actually meant me. And I don't know how we did it, but we did it. A group of us did it. And I thought it was a one-off. Several of the people who did it with me said, well, we ought to make that into a permanent long-distance footpath. So there it is. It had a website, went through iconic sites like Tintern and Strata Florida and Valley Crucis. Went to Abbey Come Here. It went to less well-known sites like Strata Marcella. It went through monastic landscapes. These are fields which the lay brothers of the order carved out on the ridge above Margam Abbey. It went to other places as well. I mean, Tom y Mere, the Roman fort in North Wales, which is the location for one of the stories in the four branches of the Mabinogion. So we tried to explore the whole of Welsh history, not just the history of the Cistercian order. We went to some lovely little churches. This is Llanfrichwyn in the hills of North Wales above Betws y Coed. And we looked at more industrial stuff as well. These are the lead mines in the Gwydir Forest. The Cistercian Way is now, I'm afraid, very much on the back burner. It was too big a project for the very small team of us that was working on it. The website has been archived by the National Library of Wales, so it's still available, and we're hoping that it will get picked up again and people will have new ideas how to develop it. One new idea that, go back again. One new idea, which is developing out of the Cistercian Way, is this idea for a Welsh Camino, a Camino Cymraeg, a walking route taking you across South Wales to St David's. And if I go back up to my map of the Cistercian Way, you can see how the route from Tintern to Whitland would lend itself to being continued to St David's. And this is something which the Carpenter Ramblers have actually been working on. As I said earlier, they would have liked to get it up, running and waymarked in time for the 2023 celebrations, but they are still hoping to be able to. They've walked it once, they want to be able to walk it again. There are others. There's the Penrhys Pilgrim's Way from Llandaff, near Cardiff, up to Penrhys. There's the North Wales Pilgrim's Way, which has been hugely popular. That again is badging itself as a Welsh Camino because it ends up in, and essentially, Bardsey Island. And there are lots of others. There are routes from the nonconformist tradition. There's a Mary Jones route, there's an Griffiths route. There are routes which take you from West Wales over to Ireland. There's a route from St David's to Wexford, commemorating St Aidan and Ferns, to whom a couple of churches in West Wales are dedicated. So it's very much an idea that's developing. The amount which pilgrimage to Compostela has put into the Spanish economy is staggering. The amount which the pilgrimage to Mecca puts into the economy there is literally millions every year. So there is an agenda for using pilgrimage as a form of tourism, as a form of economic development. And I was quite interested to find that it's something which is being talked about in the Senedd. Darren Miller, who is the member of the Senedd for Clwyd West, recently in a debate in the Senedd asked, what action is the Welsh Government taking to promote Wales's faith heritage? Now, the Welsh Government did come up with a faith heritage action plan back in, I think, 2013, and nothing much has been done about it since. Having got the paperwork done, they thought they'd done the job. However, Mark Drakeford, in answer to Darren Miller's question, said, and I'm quoting from the Senedd website here, the Pilgrim Way in North Pembrokeshire, linking North Pembrokeshire with Wexford in Ireland, linking St David's with St Aidan of Ferns in Ireland, is a fantastic project. There are, he says, over 1,500 miles of pilgrim ways in Wales. They are more popular today than they have been for many years past. In terms of tourism and attracting people in, we have a steady number of visitors from Germany particularly, who come to Wales because of those pilgrim routes and who are attracted to it because of the interest that they have at home. So pilgrimage still has enormous potential. What do we get out of it now? It can still produce healing. It can produce community regeneration. Again, an example from South Wales, a group of young people in quite a deprived housing estate in Cwmbran, this is some years ago, discovered that the pilgrimage route ran literally through their housing estate, wanted to find out more about it, found the website for My Cistercian Way website, walked along the route to Penfreece, and Iolo Williams got involved, made a television programme about it. It was enormously good fun. Building on this, a local group created something which they called the Ancient Cwmbran Society, badged up as the ancient history of a new town. It made a considerable contribution to community regeneration because people in Cwmbran think they're living somewhere new, somewhere that doesn't have roots. It's a new town. People on the Hollybush estate thought they were living somewhere that was basically a bit rubbish. And then they discover that they have this enormously important pilgrimage route running through their town, running through their housing estate, and it helps them. And then finally, yes, there is pilgrimage in a time of COVID. Hafiz, the great Persian mystic. I felt in need of a great pilgrimage, so I sat still for 3 years. Thank you.